What if the idea of hell wasn't born in the mind of God, but in the torture chambers of the Roman Empire? When we think of hell today, the Bible paints a picture of eternal fire, of weeping and gnashing of teeth, a place of unending torment. But the original afterlife in the Old Testament was something completely different. It was a silent, gloomy darkness. A dusty pit called Sheol where every soul went, good and bad. There was no fire. There was no torture. So where did the modern nightmare of hell actually come from? To find the answer, we have to look away from Scripture and toward the most brutal public spectacles of cruelty in human history, Roman executions. Before hell was a landscape of fire and agony, the afterlife in ancient Hebrew thought was far simpler and, frankly, kind of boring. It was called Sheol. Mentioned over 65 times in the Hebrew Bible, Sheol wasn't a place of punishment or reward. It was an underground world of darkness and dust, the final destination for everyone, righteous and wicked alike. When the patriarch Jacob thought his son Joseph was dead, he cried that he would go down to Sheol. It was just the end. No judgment, no pitchforks, no flames. It was the great equalizer, a silent pit where all souls rested in a sort of dreamless sleep. And this idea wasn't unique to the Israelites. The ancient Greeks had a similar concept in Hades. In fact, when the Hebrew scriptures were later translated into Greek, the word Hades was often used to replace Sheol. Just like Sheol, the common idea of Hades was a gloomy, shadowy underworld for all the dead. Now, Greek mythology did have a special section for torment called Tartarus, but that was for monsters and titans, not your average person. For most people, Hades was just a grim, monotonous existence. So the foundational concepts that fed into early Judeo-Christian thought were missing the one ingredient we now associate with hell: horrific, unending pain. The early afterlife was dusty, quiet, and dark. The question, then, is a big one. If the original afterlife wasn't a place of torture, why did it become one? Where did all the screaming and eternal flames come from? To answer that, we have to look away from ancient theology and toward the bloody, brutal reality of the world's reigning superpower, the Roman Empire. In the first century, when the books of the New Testament were being written, the most terrifying place on earth wasn't some mythological underworld. It was any city square in the Roman Empire. Roman state punishment wasn't hidden behind closed doors. It was public theater, a gruesome spectacle designed to be as slow, painful, and humiliating as possible to crush any thought of rebellion. And its methods gave writers a real-world vocabulary for the torments of the damned. And the most infamous method, of course, was crucifixion. Reserved for slaves, rebels, and non-citizens, it was a punishment so vile that the Roman statesman Cicero called it the most cruel and disgusting penalty. The Jewish historian Josephus, who saw it firsthand, called it the most wretched of deaths. The horror didn't start at the cross. It began with scourging, where the victim was stripped, tied to a post, and flogged with a flagrum, a whip with multiple leather thongs, embedded with sharp pieces of bone or metal. This would rip flesh from the body, often leaving the victim in a state of shock before the main event even began. Then, the condemned was forced to carry the heavy crossbeam, or patibulum, weighing anywhere from 75 to 125 pounds, through the streets to a public execution site. There, they were nailed to the wood, often not through the palms, as is commonly depicted, but through the wrists, where spikes would have been driven between the bones, a process which could sever nerves and send bolts of searing pain up the arms. Death came slowly, over hours or even days, from a horrific combination of blood loss, shock, and, for many, asphyxiation. A popular theory holds that to breathe, the victim had to push up on their nailed feet, causing excruciating pain until exhaustion made it impossible, and they suffocated. During the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Romans crucified so many people, up to 500 a day according to the historian Josephus, that they reportedly ran out of wood for crosses and room to place them. But crucifixion was just one tool in Rome's arsenal of horror. Another was death by fire, or vivi crematio. One of the most horrific forms was the tunica molesta, the annoying shirt. The historian Tacitus records that after the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, Emperor Nero blamed the Christians and had them executed this way, using their burning bodies as human torches to illuminate his garden parties at night. And if that wasn't terrifying enough, there was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This punishment saw unarmed people thrown naked into arenas like the Colosseum to be mauled to death by starved and agitated wild animals like lions, bears, and leopards. In some cases, Christian martyrs were mockingly baptized in their own blood as leopards tore them apart. This was the world the first Christians lived in. The sounds of torture and the smell of burning flesh weren't abstract ideas. They were the terrifying, tangible reality of Roman power. When Jesus and the New Testament writers needed a language to describe the ultimate consequences of rejecting God, they didn't have to invent a new vocabulary of horror. Many scholars believe they simply drew from the most extreme suffering their audience already knew and feared: Roman state-sponsored terror. Take the phrase, weeping and gnashing of teeth, used 7 times in the New Testament. Today it sounds like a metaphor for regret, but in the first century it was the literal sound of public agony. It was the sound of victims on crosses, grinding their teeth in unimaginable pain. The writers used a shared, audible experience of suffering to communicate divine judgment. And the fire? The idea of an unquenchable fire becomes much more concrete when you live in a world with human torches. This phrase, used by both John the Baptist and Jesus, directly mirrored the gruesome spectacle of the tunica molesta, a fire that couldn't be put out until it had completely consumed its victim. The imagery was also powerfully connected to a real place called Gehenna. Gehenna, or the Valley of Hinnom, was a ravine outside Jerusalem with a dark history as a site of pagan child sacrifice by fire. By the 1st century, tradition holds it was being used as the city's garbage dump, a place where trash, animal carcasses, and the bodies of criminals were discarded. With fires smoldering to consume the waste and maggots infesting the filth, it was a foul, disgusting place. When Jesus warns of a place where their worm does not die and the fire is not quenched, he wasn't just speaking of a mythical realm. He was pointing to a real, repulsive, ever-burning garbage dump just outside the city walls, a physical place that perfectly embodied a state of utter ruin and defilement. The connection seems undeniable. The slow, days-long torment of crucifixion could have provided a blueprint for the concept of eternal punishment. The public humiliation on the cross informed the imagery of shame in the outer darkness. The arena, where victims were torn apart by beasts, gives context to apocalyptic visions of a lake of fire and the reign of the beast. The early Christian writers, it appears, used the language of the empire's worst atrocities to describe the gravity of spiritual judgment. It was a communication strategy rooted in shared trauma. For a 1st century audience, saying that hell was like being subjected to a Roman execution was the most powerful and terrifying warning imaginable. Exploring these hidden connections in history is what this channel is all about. If you're finding this investigation into the real-world origins of our beliefs as fascinating as we do, go ahead and subscribe and click that notification bell. You won't want to miss where our next journey into the past takes us. For 2,000 years, the imagery of hell has haunted the human imagination, shaping art, culture, and our deepest beliefs. But its fiery architecture wasn't built in a vacuum. The terrifying descriptions of torment in the New Testament weren't purely divine revelation. Many scholars argue they were profoundly shaped by the all-too-real brutality of the Roman Empire. The weeping, the gnashing of teeth, the unquenchable fire, these were reflections of real suffering witnessed in public squares and arenas. The concept of hell was forged from the most extreme cruelty that first-century people could imagine, used by early Christian writers to paint a picture of ultimate separation from God in the most potent terms they had. The fear of hell has shaped our world, but its origins are a stark reminder that sometimes our greatest fears are just a reflection of the horrors we create for ourselves.